Hello, we continue our broadcasting from Kiev, and today we have very special guest. Our guest today is Dr. Yagil Henkin, a military historian, a lecturer at the Israel Defense Force Command and Staff College, and a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. And Dr. Henkin specializes in modern war, military strategy, and he is the author of several books on military history. Dr. Henkin, hello, and thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome.
Doctor, let me start our speak today with our interview today with the situation around the Russia's-Ukrainian war. After the 3 years of big war, um, sometimes we say that this war destroyed many conception of modern war. What is the biggest strategic illusion is exposed?
I think the biggest strategic illusion that was destroyed is that the area of industrialized warfare is over. Almost all Western countries went down the same path. Very expensive weapons, very complicated, accurate, sophisticated weapons, which, because of their cost, the cost years, uh, it takes years to develop. You can't manufacture them on a large scale, and they cost a lot. So all countries believed they can, if they will have enough, which enough isn't very much, uh, accurate weapons, they precision strikes, etc. With enough precision strikes, uh, uh, you can cut down the enemy and destroy its command structure and bring it to its heels in a very short time. For that reason, when the war in Ukraine started, basically Ukraine was expending more artillery shells than the Western world was manufacturing combined, because nobody ever expected that kind of war. And of course, we also saw that when the Americans wanted to step up their production, they found themselves in a very peculiar situation. For example, they couldn't find parts for their Stinger missiles because they closed down that production line 18 years prior. So they start converting back factories to manufacture weapons, buying ammunition from whoever produces them around the world, South Korea, India, etc. And right now we saw the Americans are in, I can say they are very afraid that they lost the trains, that they are late for the train. So they're now stepping up their production. They're in a full panic mode. They're looking around and saying, okay, we don't have enough weapons. That was, I think, was one of the concepts. In Israel, we saw it from the same, exactly the same thing happened. We reduced the size of our infantry forces. We reduced the size of our tank brigades. We invested a lot in cyber technology, in precision weapons, extremely expensive planes. Take, for example, in the cost, relatively speaking, the cost of one F-35, you could buy back in 1994, adjusted for inflation, you could buy yourself 100 and something P-51 fighters. Of course, they can't do exactly what the F-35 can do. It's a way more advanced fighter. However, 100 P-51s could be at 100 places, and one F-35 cannot be in 100 places. So the military suddenly found out it's important to be in many places at once. So you need way more equipment, way more tanks, way more planes. And of course, one of the reasons, in my opinion, I'm I have to be careful when I speak to an Ukraine to Ukrainian because you're there and I'm not. But from my point of view, one of the reasons why Ukraine started to lead the world in drones was basically because it had no other options. Russia had other options, so it was slow to recognize what's happening with drones because it has had its own air support and had its own artillery storage, etc. But since Ukraine didn't have all of those things, it managed to turn the deficiency into efficiency and produce way more drones than everyone else thought, and then became world leader, I think. I usually tell my students, look at Ukraine. Whatever you see there, assume it would happen here a few months later.
Professor, do you think that this situation with weapons is a heritage of Cold War or, Soviet military heritage? I mean, this big war, big weapons, expensive weapons, and of course now it is absolutely another situation. Does it mean that?
Yes,
Yeah.
the thing is, usually bad solutions come out of real problems. It's not that someone decided, okay, I'm going to do something really stupid. It's they had real problems, and one of the problem was that everybody remembered World War II and nobody wanted to replicate it. And everybody saw that, for example, in the Vietnam War, they had it should have been one-sided war with the American technological advantage, yet the Americans lost. And everybody thought, okay, we are throwing, and they threw more bombs on South Vietnam than they did on Germany. North Vietnam, sorry, and still they lost. So people started saying, okay, our old ways are not working. So here, both the West and the Soviets started basically at the same time. Everybody tried to prevent the bloodshed of the Second World War. And how to do it? If we will have technology, if we will have advantage, we can do it fast and prevent the bloodshed. And in a way, it was exactly the same way as forced philosophers of aerial warfare after World War One believed they could bomb a country into submission quite fast, and then they could prevent the horrors of World War One. They were wrong, of course. We got World War II. So after in the 70s, when you had finally you had precision munition come in age. For example, there was one bridge in Vietnam which the Americans attacked about 8 times and never managed to hit it and lost planes. And then suddenly they had laser guided munitions and 4 bombs and the bridge was out. So it looked like a solution. And then you had computers, and of course, it is a solution. And we got to the point where I think it's the fourth time in the history of warfare when the problem of military intelligence is having too much information. Usually, the problem was you didn't know. Now you have so much information, you have a hard time finding out what's exactly happening because there's too much of it. So they thought, okay, now we have precision munition and we have big data and we have extremely accurate intelligence. And then they found out the hard way, everyone found out the hard way, that the principles of war didn't change. And since both sides are intelligent people trying to kill each other and overcome each other, then every magic weapon had a very short life before it stopped doing its magic because the other side managed to develop something. So, whereas even 2 years ago, people believed that the drone revolution would bring with it another blitzkrieg. But after I would say, the very impressive successes of the forced Ukrainian counterattack, we got to the point where the situation is that again, I'm seeing as my point of view is as seen from the Middle East, and I hope I'm correct. Anyway, from here it looks that all of this technology helped bring the the front to a halt, where you cannot put people on the front and expect them to survive, and definitely it's terribly hard to achieve a breakthrough. So we are back in some ways to World War One. I remember that again. I think it was 2 years ago that General Zaluzhny said we are having World War One all over again, and I said, okay, this is something worth listening. And I think he was extremely correct. The thing is, he said, technology is evolving faster than strategy, and we got to the point where the weapons were supposed to bring one result, but the end result is the opposite. And so I think this is the face of modern war today, until someone will find out a way to develop it, in a way to bypass it. And I think in this way, you can see some similarities, despite the vast differences between the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, which is the attempt of the defender to prevent the attacker from using his technological advantage or superior forces. So you can have here in Gaza, everything is going underground, and we have the tunnels. And one of the advantages of having tunnels dozens of meters deep as well, you cannot hit them with artillery, and you can't see what's happening with them with intelligence. And when you get in, it's a soldier against a soldier. And of course, you have a soldier with a drone and a soldier with a dog, but in the end, the tunnelers, the Americans called urban warfare the great leveler, because it levels the sides, the great equalizer. It makes very vastly different forces fight on the same terms. So I think you can see this attempt to make the other side fight on your terms happening both in Gaza and in Ukraine. And I think one of the reasons why both in Gaza, Gaza is a very small area. It's 360 square kilometers, if I remember correctly. Yet when you have more tunnels than the London Underground and the New York Underground combined, then the fighting becomes nearly impossible, and everything takes longer and longer, even if you ignore the question of hostages. And in Ukraine, again, you have drones and counter drones and gliding bombs and robots and whatever it is. But and in the end, the situation is that breakthrough is very hard to achieve. Not as whereas all of the people, the military thinkers who developed it, spent the last generation trying to achieve a breakthrough. In the end, their attempts were to create a situation when breakthrough is all but impossible. I, of course, hope that the Ukraine would find a way, and it won't be impossible, but it is terribly hard.
You say that technology developed faster than strategy.
This
Is I
yes,
understand correct? Is I
this was
understand
Zaluzhny's words. Yes.
Mhm. In that case, let me use two terms: attrition and maneuver.
Yeah.
What really decide war today? Resources or adaptation? In that case,
Napoleon once said that God is on the side of the greater battalions, but you have to have good commanders in order to use those greater battalions. Otherwise, again, we are going back to World War One, when you had so many people that it just became a bloodbath and attrition warfare. With of course, the most infamous example is the Battle of Verdun. So here we see adaptation is necessary, because on a grand scale, we are seeing a war of attrition. By the way, both in Gaza and in Ukraine. But in order to adapt, and especially when I think when Ukraine, as it's not secret, it's a smaller country and doesn't have the manpower, and of course not the reckless ways in which the Russians use their manpower. As you know, they they find it completely acceptable if they have 90% casualty rate in order to capture a position. I think, from my point of view, it's madness. But, well, it's the Russians. So anyway, but the thing is, in order to so you have attrition warfare, but in order to survive, you have to adapt really fast. Again, I'll go back to World War One. The question: most people think that the problem was that the generals in World War One were idiots who didn't understand the advance of technology. No, they weren't idiots at all. The problem was that they got to a point where all the well-known doctrine didn't survive the test of battle, so they were always trying something new, but nobody knew what worked until something worked. And until something worked, they spent so much ammunition and, more important, lives.
Does it mean that in this new war, the role of officers of middle, command, yeah, means much more than during the previous war?
Yes. Again, sorry, I'm always going time and again to World War One, but I think because that's the most accurate comparison. And at least in the Western world, we all have a fixation about World War Two, but I think that's not the correct comparison. In World War One, in the end there were two ways in which the battle was decided and the front was breached. One of them was the Allied ways, which is when people like Monash and others developed a way of combined arms attack with the proper use of tanks and artillery barrage and planes all together in a coordinated move, which was unheard of earlier in the war. And the other way was the German way, when the Germans almost had no tanks. They manufactured less than 100 tanks during World War One. The Allies manufactured thousands and thousands. The Germans, what they did is they developed what is known as a stormtroopers, small groups of soldiers which learned to fight independently, and in that case they had their orders, and their way of fighting was that they could decide what to do without having orders from above, and they had a wide permission to use their initiative as they wanted. The Germans managed, when during Operation Michael in March 1980, to break the Allied front, and they eventually they ran out of soldiers, but not before advancing dozens of kilometers, which was unheard of at that time. So you either find a solution by finding a better combined arm tactics, which may happen, or otherwise you teach people not to fight in wide formations as they did at the beginning of the war, but to take initiative and exploit every vulnerability in the enemy's defenses. And I think that's in the current situation, that's a must when you want to survive, because people cannot. The situation is also, it's very slow, but it's still dynamic, and you cannot. And when you have people sitting there in their small 2 to 4 people positions beneath the ground, then it's a battalion commander cannot possibly control all of his people because they're too spread out. So he would have to give his platoon, not even company, platoon commanders initiative to do force and report next, because they can still know what's happening. Basically, his role may be relegated to support those who know what's happening, because the sector he has is way too big, and he has not enough people to control them personally. So yes, initiative and letting people try everything to see if something works, that's probably the best way forward.
Does it mean that in that case, NATO, for example, need to make many change in their understanding of strategy of war, of modern war?
Yes, with one caveat is we are not sure what of the Ukrainian experience is applicable to other conflicts. That is, every war is unique, but there is always a question of what is so unique because of the specific condition that it won't happen in other places, and what is unique but not enough and can be replicated in other cases. Anyway, I think NATO has to check out. That is, I'm sure that not everything can be copied from Ukraine. It would be terrible tactics to decide Ukrainians are doing something, so we have now to change NATO into a Ukrainian army. But, and that's a very great but, okay, let's assume the challenges of the Ukrainian battlefield. You have 4,500 drones buzzing around. How will your armored brigade adapt to that? You have every soldier being a target to 4 or 5 drones if he lets himself out in the open. How do you adapt to that? You have people living under bombardment for days and months. How do you adapt to that? An old American research of World War II got to the conclusion that if you have continuous fighting, most people become useless. That was their term, not mine. I'm quoting. After 140 to 160 days, and almost nobody is able to fight if he has to fight without respite for 200 days. So, okay, we saw in Ukraine that there are sectors where people are under the daily fighting for months. Okay, how does NATO prepare for that? It's not that the war would be exactly the same as it happens in Ukraine. It's a question, okay, we have those challenges in Ukraine. Is NATO ready for them? In case that they may happen again, I'm not sure that NATO has any reason to be optimistic. It definitely has. I see all the time NATO countries training Ukrainian soldiers. I think, at least in some cases, NATO countries should try and have Ukrainian soldiers training them, and then see how does this go and are they ready? Because, as I said, it's the next war that NATO is involved in won't be exactly like Ukraine, but they better check out what would be like Ukraine instead of saying, okay, our doctrine is fine, we just need to adhere to it. It may not be the case.
Many experts, different experts, political, military experts, at the beginning of big invasion in 2022, say that the war in Ukraine is very similar to the war which Israel have many decades. Do you think that this comparison is correct, or it is absolutely different context?
It's half correct. That is, when we saw the invasion, the first part was quite similar. That we had, it was everyone who knew the Yom Kippur War said, okay, this kind of mobile warfare, we know it, and we have some experience with that. But the current situation in Ukraine now is very different than what we ever saw, and definitely, in my opinion, it's very serious, and it's not something like the way that we are fighting now. For example, as I said, I'm going back time and again to drones. We are worried of drones, and we suffered the drones attack, but nothing on the same scale. So most of our people can still go doing their own thing without having to look to the sky every minute. That's a very big difference, and Of course, I hope that in Israel it would stay this way, but nobody can guarantee us that. So there is changes, but again, the thing is that you don't need to copy, but you need to learn and adapt. For example, one thing that was very popular before the war was to say, okay, the tank has no place in modern war. Apparently, in Ukraine, it proved that the tank definitely has its place, and the more the merrier. It wasn't just not the same place it was. We didn't see tank divisions fighting each other like in World War II, but the fire support and ambushes, etc., proved extremely important. So you knowing how to use tanks remains crucial. Right at the moment, as much as I understand, tanks are not near the war because of the problem of breakthrough. But since even the Russians apparently didn't give up their hope, because we know they're creating new formations, so they hope that one day they will breach the front, and then they can send their tanks to exploit it blitzkrieg style. And of course, I hope it would happen the opposite way. But the thing is that the tanks will still, if you'll have Ukrainian breakthroughs, we don't know how exactly it would happen, but then you will need to exploit the breakthrough and you need the tanks. So you always have to continue and adapt. But tanks today, if you looked at the Chinese military demonstration 2 weeks ago, I think, one of the things that they did, they brought forth a new light tank and not very light, armored personnel carrier. So that was definitely for their scenario of invasion of Taiwan. But when you saw that their armored personnel carrier carries also a drone on it, built-in drone, and you saw that they have so many antennas that some of them I have no idea what they are doing, but you see they definitely put a premium on battlefield connectivity. And as we saw with Ukrainian artillery, we called it in Israel, we had a slang for it. It was like taxi drivers sharing rides. So you see a target, okay, who's free to engage it? Okay, I'll do it. That's it. Now I think it looks obvious, but it's not. It's a way you need a way of battlefield coordination which was unheard of several years ago to do it fast enough. So again, there are similarities, there are differences. The question is, of course, what can we learn from each other, and what is similar and what will be different.
Let's back for the drones. Yesterday, I have interview with military experts who is specialist in Russia's weapons, and he told me that Russia have very interesting and Ukraine have very interesting way. For example, Russia from missiles to drones, but Ukraine now from drones to missiles.
Yes.
Does it mean the drone is just just immediately decision for just situation for now, and everything will be back for these big missiles, artillery, tanks, but more modern, for example?
That's a very good question. I cannot say for sure because I don't know, but as I said earlier, one of the reasons that Ukraine got the lead is because it had no other options. So finally, after the Russians are catching up, and they said, hey, the guys on the other side had some good ideas. And Ukraine, on the other hand, is catching up and it's getting more weapons and it's beefing up its production. For example, the Bogdana, which you know as well, the first Bogdana took, I think, 9 months to produce. And now you're saying they're producing 40 self-propelled guns a month, which is amazing. So everyone started from a very different position, but Russia started understanding that some of the Ukrainian tactics and means had a merit, and Ukraine had the capability to produce and use weapons it didn't have before. So it's going toward the similar middle ground from two very different starting points. I don't think drones would disappear. We definitely, but we will see loads of electronic warfare. We already see, again, the Chinese, now one of their most interesting vehicles was something that probably is supposed to produce an electromagnetic pulse in order to just blow drones out of the sky. And we will see, and it would be, and most weapons do not keep their edge for a very long time. Back in the 16th century, when the French brought their cannons into Italy, so you saw the fortresses crumbling in days, even fortresses that usually held out for years. But then, after it was slower back then, but it takes several years, and new siege engineers appeared, and they learned how to counter cannons, and suddenly siege became a very long effort again, sometimes more longer than before the invention of cannon. That is, the balance shifts, but it rarely the balance stays with one a weapon. I would take atomic bombs out of the equation because we have, or at least I don't have any good way to combine our atomic bombs with normal doctrine, but with usually it would be you would have a weapon giving you an advantage, and then the enemy countering it, and it would continue to be a cat of mouse. And then we are going back to what you said about the adaptation, because it becomes not only the specification of the weapon, but it becomes people who know to use it better. Back in World War II, when the Germans did their Blitzkrieg thing in 1940, they had less tanks than the French, and their tanks were mostly less technologically advanced and with weaker armor and smaller guns than the French. However, they learned to use them in a much better way. For example, the French put in each French turret, you usually had two people. So the commander had to be the gunner, and sometimes the radio operator had too much things to do. The Germans, always put in, after their four small models, they put in a gunner, a commander, and a radio operator. So the commander could command just command, where and not try doing three things at the same time. Moreover, they gave radios to each and every tank and plane, whereas the Allies had it to a company commander level, which meant that the German tank battalion could move way faster than a French tank battalion, because only 4 people in the French battalion had radios, and they had then to flag or message to the other guys, whereas the commander of the German tank battalion would issue a command and everyone would start doing it. So it wasn't the weapon itself, it was the way you use it that gave you the advantage. And I think this would happen again here. Weapons would be copied from one side of the front to another side, as we saw it happen. And the real difference would be between the command cultures, and whoever would have the better command culture would have a significant advantage.
Many years, more than 3 years, Western leaders and Western governments have dreamed to localize Russia's Ukrainian war only in the borders of Ukraine. And of course, in history, if I'm right, during the last decades, we saw many local war, proxy war. Would you like to name them? Yes, but yeah, sorry, I just continue and let you speak.
Okay.
And do you think that during this modern war, it is possible to localize such big war like in Ukraine where many countries directly or indirectly involved during the modern weapons, and we know that many drones just cross the of NATO and other things. Yeah, do you think that it is possible to localize more modern wars?
I think the main problem is the dream that if just one side would act, wants to localize the war, the others would some for one reason or another oblige. There is a story about General Pickett. He was a Confederate officer. He led the last charge in the Battle of Gettysburg, and after the war, he was asked by a journalist why was the Confederate Army defeated at Gettysburg. So he thought a minute and said, "I think the Union Army had something to do with that." And that was a very good answer, because most people try to find why had one side failed and one side win, but they don't analyze it in the context of both sides fighting another. So I think the hope to localize the war, by the way, there was a very simple way to localize the Ukraine war, which is, of course, to surrender to Putin. He got what he is, no war. Okay, fine. And of course not. But when the decision is to fight Putin and to support Ukraine, the idea that NATO would support Ukraine and then Russia would say, okay, that's fine, we'll just sit in Ukraine and we'll be under the pressure of NATO and we'll do nothing to counter NATO pressure and there to support Ukraine, it's basically nonsense. Of course, they will try to do something. And as we also what we see with all of the drones suddenly appearing in all of the countries near Ukraine, I think this is something we know very well from Israel. It's you start pushing the boundaries slowly, and of course you don't. And for example, we had in the year before the war, we had Hezbollah in Lebanon. They built a tent. It's silly as it sounds. They built a tent which crossed about 20 meters into Israel. And we debated for months what to do with this damn tent. Is it worth going to war against Hezbollah for the sake of a tent which which is only 20 meters in our territory? The answer should have been yes, unqualified yes, because if the Hezbollah didn't stop, its aim didn't stop 20 meters inside Israel. It was testing the border, and it was testing the boundaries. So same thing, when you see those drones starting to appear in Estonia and Poland, it's Russia testing the boundaries. And if they believe they can continue with it, they will go further and further and further. Salami tactics. There's a very good. If you have seen Yes, Prime Minister, the famous British comedy, they have an excellent 3-minute sketch on salami tactics in the context of the Cold War. And it's the best 3-minute piece of strategy I ever seen, because it explains the problem. If you think Berlin is Berlin important enough to fight a nuclear war over it? No. Okay, so what is? If they invade Western Germany, would you start a nuclear war? No. Again, and so on and so on. So where do you start? Piccadilly Circus. So that's a problem. Either you act or you don't. But to believe that you will appease the other side, which has its own priorities, which aren't the same priorities as ours. Of course, Russia wouldn't have gone to war if it had the same priorities of NATO or Ukraine, but it went to war. So you have to assume that Putin is actually meaning what he says, and you have to assume that if he threats NATO, then he may actually mean what he says, and you cannot assume that if you'll just ignore the problem, it would go away. It won't. And this, unfortunately, in Israel, we learned that with a very dear price, when we believe that if we'll just we won't raise the temperatures and the fire wouldn't start. There is a good reason to think that one of the reasons why we didn't, on the night of October 7, when we started seeing suspicious signs, why we didn't put all of the army on readiness was that we were afraid that Hamas may interpret us as starting to begin a war, and then if it didn't want to begin a war, it would. But the problem was that Hamas actually planned to begin a war, so we just made sure that we would start it from a terrible position.
What do you think about the future of this war in Gaza? What do you think about perspective?
Right now, it's very hard to know because of all the negotiations going on. The main problem that Israel had is twofold. One is the fact of the hostages. Once releasing the hostages became one of the aims of the war, then Hamas has a very powerful negotiation tool because it can hold, as long as it holds to the hostages, it can make sure that it would survive after the war. So, and this is the problem since Israel didn't find a way. Unless a miracle would happen and the IDF would find out how to rescue all of the hostages without them being killed, then Israel is in a strategic quagmire. The second thing, if we ignore this question, the thing, in my opinion, the way to finish the war in Gaza is basically now it's a war, it's not counterinsurgency. The way would be to turn it into counterinsurgency, which means to capture the whole area, it would cost a lot, both to us, to Palestinian civilians, unfortunately, and then to have a military rule for several years until someone comes up with a good solution. Of course, what I said here has its own significant costs, and this is why Israel wasn't very happy to do it until now. But unless the war ends, if Hamas stays, it won't have to formally stay. As long as it holds the power, it the problem would continue. Same thing that you have, for example, with drug cartels. Most of the time, they don't have their ministers in the government because they don't need, because everyone in the government knows too well not to try and fight the drug cartels. So here, Hamas can say, oh, we are no longer in power, but as long as it would have its fighters and its weapons, it would be in power, and every so-called government would just be a front window for a shop window for Hamas. So I think the thing is this is the problem that Israel needs to rout Hamas and capture the Gaza Strip, but the prices it would have to pay for doing so are extremely high, especially when you consider the genocide allegations, etc., and the fact that if we will finally capture the Gaza Strip and start military rule, you can expect not only astronomical prices of restructuring the area, but also you can expect that half the world would continue pressuring us to end that rule and retreat. So the situation is I would say it's better than 2 years ago, but it's not that good.
Let's look for one more aspect. If you look for the situation around the Israel and around the Russia's-Ukrainian war, is there any historical precedent for wars so public, documented, and turned into a media event? Doesn't matter for the war.
Not in this way, but I think that every generation had its own turning point. When the first war photographers went into combat in the American Civil War, it was in the Crimean War. It caused a shock when the British public saw the movie and the fourth day and the song. It caused a shock because nobody saw anything like that before. And then you had World War II with live, not live, but movies all around, and you had the war reporters in the Vietnam War, and all of these things were unprecedented at the time. Now, I think the unique challenge is that you don't have any official version anymore. That is, you have, but nobody really bothers checking it because everyone when you have prior to social networks. Well, you knew that you will get the official version on the state television, and you will get, let's say, another version on channel this and channel that, but the number of channels are limited. But when today the numbers of channels are unlimited, so everyone has his own tailor-made information, and this is a situation which I think makes the job of each and every army very complicated, especially if it doesn't have its free net of supporters, which means one of the challenges that army face today is that they don't have only to face the counterintelligence operations and the intelligence operations of the other army. They have to face the whole internet. I remember one example from the beginning of the war when the Russians did did a TV broadcast with one of their heavy mortars in the background, so people on the internet found its location, and in no time it was destroyed. In another time, the Ukrainians did a TV broadcast from a tank repair depot in Kiev, and someone on a Russian Telegram group found out the place because of the size and shape of two windows. Amazing job, I would say, from a technical point, and that was destroyed too. So it's not only that you have the propaganda war going on uncontrolled because the state cannot direct it. It's the people who identify with the state are waging the propaganda war, whether the state asks them or not. It's also that the open source intelligence is becoming way more important than it was in the past because people are getting real-time information from what is broadcasted, and you can see way more people. You have no army has more analysts on the internet, and you have more analysts on the internet than they would tell you. So you have a problem when you want to deceive the enemy. You have a problem when you want to hide things, of course, and you and everything, almost everything is broadcasted in nearly real time. By the way, one of the refutations, for example, for the allegations of genocide was that you say you have those cameras in Gaza. How come just in the right time when you don't have pictures of all the terrible things you believe that happened? You have other terrible pictures, but when you try and pinpoint many of the worst allegations, you cannot. They say, okay, when everything is photographed and still you cannot find those things, it's a counter argument. So it's a whole mess, and I'm not sure militaries are fully equipped to deal with it.
Dr. Henkin, let me ask the last question. Sorry, I understand that you have a long interview, but let me ask the last. Yeah,
No.
the last one. Yeah. Last decades, we saw many frozen conflicts, many. And do you think that in modern world, victory still means anything? And do you think that victory, what does it mean, victory for modern wars? Because I cannot imagine where you see the victory during the last decades. And in that case, what what you think about the future of Russia's Ukrainian?
First of all, I think victory, the simple way to see if you have a victory is that you don't have to ask the question. But realistically, again, World War II was an anomaly. Most wars are not finished in that kind of success for the Allies and failure for the Germans. When we go back to Karl von Clausewitz, the greatest thinker who ever wrote about war, he stated it quite clearly that wars rarely are finished before the causes run out. So that is the thing. But again, the question of victory is also it's not only what you wanted to achieve, because the goals of war always shift during the war itself. Let's take World War II. Germany went for war for a living area in the east, and the Allies went to war to honor their obligations to conflict to Poland. 5 years later, the Allies are fighting to get the world rid of the total evil, and the Germans are fighting for the survival of the Aryan race. Very different goals than what they had when the war began. So shifting goals are the norm. However, and so the question is what? For example, if someone, let's say that the war between Russia and Ukraine ends today in exactly the same place you have. I would say total prisoner swap, but the situation on the ground is as it is today. So now the question is who won would really depend on what people wanted to achieve. I heard Mr. Putin's speech a few days before the war. It was very clear that what he was saying is no more Ukraine. So if Ukraine fought out and managed well to stay Ukraine, so it didn't achieve everything it wanted, but it would have a legitimate argument that it had victory. And if Russia, let's say, for example, that Mr. Putin wouldn't have wanted to cancel Ukraine, but would just start his invasion and would say, "I'm going for the Donbas." Well, then we would probably say he won because he has the Donbas. It all depends on what you want to achieve. And the greater things you want to achieve, the lower are the chance that you achieve them. If your goals are limited, it's very easy to declare victory. If your goals are unlimited, it's impossible to declare, and everything is between. So we didn't, most of the times in the last decade, we didn't see many decisive victories, although ask the Taliban, I think they gained a decisive victory against the Afghan government. And ask Azerbaijan, they definitely gained a decisive victory against Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh. So the thing is not if a victory can be achieved. It can. It's the question is in the specific conflict, what is the end goal of each side? What are the chances of each side achieving it? And what would each side view as victory in the conditions of that specific conflict?
Doctor, thank you so much for being with us
You're
today.
welcome.
Thank you so
It was
much.
a pleasure.
Thank you. Dr. Yegil Henkin is our guest today, and we are very happy about that. Thank you, and stay with us.